of the Annie E. Casey Foundation in Baltimore. The title of the volume is Mistakes to Success, Learning and Adapting When Things Go Wrong. As the title suggests, the book takes a courageous look at some mistakes the Casey Foundation has made over the years in its community development work, and makes the case for more such honesty and openness by foundations about their missteps and the essential role mistakes can play in the learning process. We're still putting the panel together, but it will include Rick Cohen of the nonprofit Quarterly, and George Roeder of Engineers Without Borders Canada has recently made news for establishing a new website entitled Admitting Failure, which obviously pursues the same theme. Now, for today's panel, recent issue of Dissent magazine ran an article by Joanne Barkin entitled Got Dough: How Billionaires Rule Our Schools. She begins the article thusly. The cost of K-12 public schooling in the United States comes to well over $500 billion per year. So how much influence could anyone in the private sector exert by controlling just a few $billion of that immense sum? Decisive influence, it turns out. Well, this sort of claim that a handful of ultra-wealthy foundations are able single-handedly to shape vast areas of public policy has become quite common on both the right and the left of the American political spectrum. And as the editors of American Foundations point out, this may indeed have been the case at one point in our nation's history. But how much influence do foundations truly exert today? And what rules are they able to play in a world now crowded with massive government institutions and thousands of powerful independent nonprofits, often funded by fees for service and other sources not related to foundations? That's the question. That's one of the questions that the volume before us undertakes to answer. We're fortunate to have with us one of the editors of this volume, David Hammack, an historian at the Mandel Center for Nonprofit Organizations at Case Western University, who will open today's panel with a presentation of a sort of something of an overview of its argument. He will be followed by Susan Ostrander, professor of sociology at Tufts University. Then we'll hear from Les Lenkowski, who teaches in public affairs and in the Public Affairs and Philanthropy program at Indiana University and is a frequent guest here at Hudson, of which he was formerly president. Welcome back, Les. And we'll close the presentations with Stephen Rathgeb-Smith, another contributor to the volume, who holds the Waldemar Nielsen Chair at the Georgetown Public Policy Institute. David.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for the opportunity to do this session here. I want to give a couple of other acknowledgments to start. Helmut Anheier, my co-editor and the co-director of this project, would have very much liked to be here, but he has current obligations both at UCLA and as the leader of the Hertie School of Governance in Berlin, and also as one of the key people in Heidelberg in the Center for Social Investment. And so at any given time, he's likely to be flying over the Atlantic or shuttling between Berlin and Heidelberg, and he can't be here today. This was a considerable project organized really by the Aspen Institute's nonprofit and sector and philanthropy research fund. Alan Abramson, who's here, had an important role in creating this project. Rachel Mosher-Williams was also involved with it, and others at Aspen. And we were able to do the work because we arranged for support and had good support from the Foundation Center for some data, and we also made extensive use of material from the National Center for Charitable Statistics of the Urban Institute. I think I saw Elizabeth Morris come in, and we very much appreciated that support. while Helmut did this project, he was mostly at UCLA, and their Center on Civil Society was very helpful. And I've been supported in useful ways by the Mandel Center for Nonprofit Organizations at Case Western Reserve in Cleveland. Finally, there are several, in addition to Steve Smith and me, I think I've seen, I know I've seen Stefan Tepler and Lane Benjamin here, Alice O'Connor, who's another contributor, hoped she might get here, but perhaps wasn't able to come.
She's here.
There you are. Great. Sorry, I missed you. It's always possible. There were a lot of contributors, altogether about 26 contributors to this volume, so somebody else may be as well. What I thought I would do at the outset is give an overview of the volume, and it's almost 500 pages, and it deals with a lot of different fields, so I'm going to put some of the detail is on the screen, and I won't go over it won't speak about everything that's on the screen. Some of the relevant material is in the handout that you're placed. We think I think that if there are some key innovations to the book, it's that it took an explicit and comprehensive approach, recognized that foundations have a long history and take a wide variety of forms. It put particular emphasis on fields, and I've distributed the table of contents, and you can see the 8 fields that we emphasized, and the fact that there's 2 essays on each field, and I think in every case by excellent people. We made a mix of historians and sociologists and other social scientists, policy analysts in the volume. And one thing that became clear is that there really has been considerable change over time, not only in foundations, but also in the contexts in which they work. And I guess the last point is that foundations not only engage in charity and philanthropy, they also are used to protect and control resources. So context counts is an argument. These are the fields that we included. There are a number of notable fields that we might have investigated, and we could perhaps add to that economic development, both community development and otherwise. But so we didn't do everything, but it's a pretty comprehensive look at particularly at the fields where there's been a lot of work by foundations over a considerable span of time. Now Helmut and I started out by laying out a set of hypotheses we asked all the contributors to address. And we talked about doing this, and Helmut, I think wisely it turns out, said, we have to put forward a very strong thesis, and then people will fight against it, and in fighting against a common enemy, they will create some unity to the volume. I don't know if we succeeded in getting unity to the volume, but if we did, it's perhaps because we put a strong framework out that people pushed against. So we did read the literature as thoroughly as we could, and it seemed that there were various claims made that foundations are specially able to do certain things, charitable things, philanthropic things, both control of resources and redistribution. And that the foundations have comparative advantages in 3 different kinds of roles as social entrepreneurs, as institution builders, and as risk absorbers. There also are arguments that foundations have some inherent disadvantages, insufficiency, particularism, paternalism, and amateurism. When we looked at what we found from our several contributors, it seemed to us, and as we looked at the literature, it seemed to us it really makes sense not to talk about foundations as though they've always been the same and operated in the same kinds of context, but in fact that they've operated in different distinct periods, and in each period they've taken on different character and been able to do different things. The 19th century actually is much more interesting than most accounts of foundations would have you think. There was a classic institution building period dominated by 20 or 30 foundations, and many people think that's always and everywhere been what an American foundation is. Rockefeller, Carnegie both created multiple foundations, and they were associated with Rosenwald and the Guggenheims and a number of others, and built many impressive clusters of institutions in the first third or the first half of the 20th century. But since World War II, after World War II, foundations found themselves in a very different context. And so one of the main points is that that's a major break. And since then, it's really not been possible for foundations to aspire to what they could accomplish in the first part of the 20th century. And we end by thinking that maybe at the moment foundations are accepting a new definition for themselves. Just two things I want to say about 19th century foundations. They were really critical in creating the Protestant denominations that organized so much of American life in the 19th century and well into the 20th century. The distinction between a foundation and a college was actually a very artificial distinction, and particularly as the 19th century went on. So there were some non-sectarian foundations, some of which are notable in Philadelphia, which often doesn't get the respect it deserves for its role in foundations. The Lowell Institute is quite an amazing foundation, playing a major role in science, in creation of MIT, in the creation of Northeastern University, and finally in the creation of WGBH television. But people don't think of it as a foundation, but it really was a foundation. There are a number of other funds that are perhaps better known. This is a list of the foundations of the classic era. We want to go back to that. And there were many achievements, I think, in the classic era. Or people might argue pros and cons about the nature of the achievements, but they are quite impressive. And if you disagree with what they did, they're certainly worth battling. They're also less often acknowledged some very important setbacks in the classic era. And the other thing that's usually not acknowledged is in the classic era of institution building, there were hundreds of foundations that did not join on with the Carnegie and Rockefeller-led initiatives. There were foundations that predated their creation and that continued to pursue religious and regional and idiosyncratic purposes of many kinds. Let me just take a minute and point to some of the big evidence about the shift that happened around the time of World War II. Foundations relatively declined sharply in how much wealth they have. So, in fact, I think the idea to take the quote that Bill offered from Dissent, I don't think there's any evidence that foundations have recently been putting billions into elementary and secondary education in the United States. A few million is more likely the number. And if you compare that with hundreds of billions that are spent on elementary and secondary education, if they have any influence at all, it would be quite remarkable. That situation was very different before the 1950s. This means, by the way, that when the Ford Foundation came into the picture, it was already dealing with a very changed world from the world that Carnegie and Rockefeller had been dealing with earlier. So this is just summing up federal spending on health, education, welfare. This is breaking it down by field, bringing it up to 2010, and the big shift is between 65 and 80. And some of the accounts will suggest that there were huge cuts after 1980, but there were some small shifts, and some of them were very important if you're in particular fields. But the overall expenditure did not decline. What people often don't take account of is that foundations put most of their money into the support of institutions that provide services. Health services, education services, arts services, community services, social services of various kinds. And in America, people also pay for those services out of income. Now, to have a complete account here, we ought to include Emmanuel Saez's recent charts that show the increasing disparity in income. But if you take the per capita expenditures, take the total amount spent and divide it, consumption expenditures have tripled since the 1960s. Americans were already then affluent and have become more affluent, and affluent people buy more services, which means that if a foundation is trying to change education or healthcare, it's dealing with private spending and the demands of consumers organized in many different. And foundations, the other charts have been on a basis of a 30 or 40% of the total economy. This is taking just 5% of the economy so that we can begin to see. Foundation expenditures did increase a little bit in the 90s and since 2000, but they're very small in relation to the economy. Nonprofit employment depends on private spending as well as government spending, gifts, but also sale of services, as well as government spending, and that's greatly outstripped in size private giving. So nonprofits do most of their work through foundations do most of their work through nonprofit organizations, and so that's a big change they've been dealing with. Finally, foundations have become more national. They were a Northeastern and then a Northeastern and Great Lakes phenomenon. Not so much anymore. And this is just another. There are many emphases. These are the top 50 current foundations. The coloring doesn't come through, but they're about equally dispersed in all these different fields across the different quarters of the country, and they have a lot of different focuses. One of the things that people haven't paid a lot of attention to is the use of local foundations and regional foundations to build out the complexes of institutional facilities in different parts of the U.S. This is just a Cleveland example, using the Foundation Center's list of the largest grants over a period of time. We summed them all up, and the great majority has gone to higher education, health, and cultural institutions in the elite institutions in that. I've handed out to you our summary of some of the most notable current contributions that foundations are making, and these do vary somewhat by field and listed there. So we summarized the result by saying that foundations do indeed try to do some immediate charity, providing relief, redistributing to the very poor, but they don't do much of it, and that's really because they don't have the resources to do it in a significant way. They can't complement government in a serious way, and they can't substitute for government, and it's a mistake to think they can. Foundations do attempt to do philanthropic things in the sense of attack major problems with major new departure. But that's very difficult. They're now dealing with very large fields that are heavily institutionalized, that are crowded with other forces, and they always have to worry about their legitimacy in doing that. What they are particularly notable perhaps for is the regional build-out I was describing a moment. One thing that people don't often talk about so much, but that came through to us, is that foundations are important in controlling resources and perhaps more important in controlling than in distributing. We look hard for evidence of foundations operating as social entrepreneurs, and we found some examples, particularly in catalyzing, convening, and responding to challenges that have been identified by others. Difficult for foundations to lead, but there are some cases of that. There are much of the institution building is further elaborating existing clusters of institutions. We found some efforts that are absorbing risk and maintaining continuity over time, but that's also challenging given the scale. With regard to the disadvantages, all foundations talk about insufficiency of resources. Bill Gates makes a strong point of it every time he speaks. If it's a problem for Gates, enough said. By definition, in some ways, many foundations are particular. They can't address the general welfare in a comprehensive, but they can advance highly valued purposes. We didn't find people complaining a great deal about paternalism, and in some ways it's perhaps the other side of autonomy for foundations. If they're going to be autonomous, then they are going to be saying what they think is important. Maybe we didn't look hard enough, and we could have perhaps some discussion about that. It struck us that foundations actually celebrate amateurism. The point about foundations is not that they're professional, not that they have specialized knowledge, but they bring a fresh perspective. They bring a distinctive public perspective to the table. That's often what's celebrated. I've spoken before about key turning points. I think the first one is that there really were foundations before Rockefeller and Carnegie, and the second is that their era ended by World War II. I like to end with a photograph. The cover of our book shows raindrops falling on a pond, but maybe it's a storm on a sea full of icebergs and waves, in which case how much of a ripple the individual raindrops will make.
So I'm going to offer 4 key issues that I think can perhaps help us to locate this fine book in relation to some of the large major debates about foundations today. And the issues that I'm going to suggest are 1, purpose, 2, accountability, particularly in relation to effectiveness, and 3, innovation, and 4, independence and autonomy. The first, and it seems to me the most important issue, is suggested elsewhere by Helmut Anheier, who says that foundations today are experiencing, quote, a crisis of purpose. That comes from a book that Helmut co-edited with Stefan Tepper, who is here. Some evidence of a crisis that Anheier and Hammack talk about is the fact that such a very, very small portion of charitable nonprofit revenues, 1% to be exact, comes from foundations today. And so, as David has said, foundations are becoming less and less important, meaning that there's, as they say, a significant mismatch between aspirations and available resources, unquote. And I've seen that line quoted in several places in relation to a contribution of this book. The editors do argue that foundations are experiencing a new era. In terms of a new purpose, I think they want to argue, or at least hypothesize, that foundations are now doing philanthropy more than doing charity, focusing just on one of the fields where I have some interest and expertise. I certainly agree with the chapter authors Mosley and Glaskowicz, who conclude that in regard to social welfare, foundations have certainly not in recent decades and not been able to be, and I agree probably shouldn't be, agents of charity in the sense of trying to substitute for government. I wonder if that's only about less and less resources. I suspect, and we might talk about this later, I suspect there might be some other reasons why foundations have chosen not to focus on that role. They haven't, in other words, tried to provide money and services in terms of meeting basic human needs for the members of our society who, for whatever reason, can't meet those needs on their own. So foundations have instead, as David has said, have acted as agents of what this book terms philanthropy, meaning trying to create something new and influence public policy. We can also debate, of course, about what the definition of philanthropy is. We might not want to get into that, but that's one definition. I have to say that I don't find the shift from charity to philanthropy a very compelling new purpose for foundations, and I don't really think that Anheier and Hammack do either, and I'm not sure that this book is even setting out to find a new purpose, and that's okay. But I do think that it's an issue that we need to somehow grapple with. Hammack and Anheier conclude, quote, that foundations vary so widely that it's very difficult to determine what the right thing to do might be in any general sense, unquote. I agree with that, but I think that we nonetheless have to try to still work out what we, as members of a democratic society, want these unique and uniquely privileged institutions to be doing. And I think it's important that we try to talk about what we think that purpose is, and I do think this book makes some contribution to that. I would also argue that those kinds of discussions about what foundations should be doing, what we want them to be doing, are most productive in my experience when they're grounded not in ideological or moral debates, but rather in good research. And this volume is a prime example of good research. And in that sense, it makes a valuable contribution. This book is about what foundations actually do, both well and not well. And that is, as David has suggested, all too uncommon in discussions about foundations and philanthropy in my experience. Although that's changing in recent years as serious scholars, like members of this panel, subject foundations to critical analysis. So that's purpose. The second issue that I put on the table, no matter what new scholarship we were talking about today about foundations, is of course accountability, which for me is very closely related to assessing foundation effectiveness. I published a qualitative study in 2007 in the journal Nonprofit Management and Leadership about three major foundations that had been, but were no longer, major funders in the field of higher education civic engagement. And in terms of effectiveness and accountability, those foundations seem to interpret this as meaning that they could not invest in an area where measurable results would take more than a few years. I don't mean that they were happy about that interpretation. I think they were not. Another example, respected foundation researcher Francie Ostrauer found in 2004 in a survey which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, that while foundations said they should assess their own effectiveness as a way to be accountable, they made that connection too, virtually all of them said they were not doing so. I think that Francie Ostrauer was particularly surprised to learn from that survey that it was the foundation board who was saying in this survey that setting standards derived from their own mission statement and then evaluating their own work in relation to those standards was, in the view of most of the board members that Ostrauer surveyed, quote, an unnecessary expense. Still talking about accountability. Columbia University highly respected scholar Kenneth Pruitt acknowledges in another recent book by foundations that, quote, there is no metric of foundation impact. Indeed, there is not even a theory of change, unquote. What's interesting about this is that Pruitt says that this is not a problem because foundations exist primarily to serve as an exemplar of U.S. pluralism. and he writes, quote, "The foundation need not do its job well," unquote. The foundation need not do its job well, unquote. I confess that I found Pruitt's idea simply appalling, and I suspect that Hammack and Anheier, while they might not use that provocative word, might agree with me, since what this book is about is what is the difference foundations have made? What have they actually, in fact, contributed to U.S. society? And what are they doing now to achieve impact? So that's something we could have some debate about. The third issue that I'd urge us to consider as we talk about this new book, and indeed any wonderful new scholarship in foundations, is innovation. And as this book suggests, and as I suspect we all know, innovation is perhaps the most frequently cited purpose of foundations. Anheier has written again elsewhere that, quote, "Innovative foundations are the exceptions," unquote. Over and over again, people who love foundations, people who are critic foundations, insiders, outsiders, from a whole range of ideological viewpoints, have repeatedly characterized foundations as too cautious, as passive, as merely ameliorative. The foundations that I studied saw being innovative as meaning continually funding new initiatives, and then, after a short while, moving on to something else. Again, I'm not saying they liked it, right? Sometimes abruptly, in the eyes of grantees and program officers whose areas of expertise were suddenly no longer relevant. I hear, and I'm sure you hear, and maybe you are among those nonprofit leaders who lament that to get foundation money, they must keep coming up year after year with new project, when what you need is consistent funding for the project you're already doing. Now, it is true that the numbers of foundation, the amount of foundation grants that are now going to operating funds has been going up in recent years. And in this regard, that's a good thing. Anheier and Hammack acknowledge this problem when they suggest, quote, "Foundations have made their most impressive contributions when they have committed substantial funds, expertise, and recognition to sustained work for larger and clearer purposes," unquote. Still talking about innovation. Overall, this book, like other research-based writing, suggests or at least implies that many foundations have done their best work not as innovators, but as collaborators, brokers, and conveners. Rather abstract language that we could talk about what that really means later. Some of the foundations that have been bold and innovative enough to support progressive social movements, like the foundations that I've written about and that Alice O'Connor refers to her in her chapters, like the Women's Fund, Haymarket People's Fund, and other members of the funding exchange, they have not been the large private foundations that quite rightly are the focus of this book. They have been very different kinds of foundations. Chapter authors Deborah Minkoff and John Agnone agree, saying that foundations overall have been reluctant to innovate when dealing with grantee organizations in the areas of women's rights and the rights of racial minorities, especially reluctant, as we all know, I think, to funding community grassroots organizing. The final issue that I want to suggest we put on the table today as we discuss this new book is their freedom and independence. And of course, this book does talk about that. And the issue there, of course, is that these are private institutions balanced with the responsibility of we, the public, to ensure that they provide enough public benefit to justify their considerable privileges. Again, the three foundation in my small case study felt that what had happened in their foundation sometime was that being independent meant that the idiosyncratic interests of a new top executive, a new board president, had suddenly become a new funding priority, a source of much frustration, not only to grantees, but to dedicated program officers as well. So, and maybe this is an example of the particularism that David alluded to as one of the disadvantages. For foundations themselves, it seems to me that freedom, independence, autonomy may be their most important feature. I observe how foundations as a group and the organizations that represent them often use the appeal to independence and autonomy, freedom, as the main rationale for mounting well-organized, well-coordinated effort to strongly and successfully object not only to government-defined directives, but also to propose self-enforced policies and practices. Take, for example, the collective refusal by foundations to support policies that would increase foundation payout by 1% from 5 to 6, limit the maximum size of foundations, and monetary payment to foundation trustees, make basic information about foundations available to the general public free of charge, and prohibit foundations from preventing their grantees to lobby, which is, of course, the right of nonprofits under law, circumscribed and within certain limits, we understand. And, of course, the issue of how much independence and autonomy foundations should have raises the matter of their tax-exempt privilege. In Boston, where I come from, you may have read that the mayor has appointed a task force that has just formally proposed, after a year of study, that local nonprofits, including foundations, voluntarily pay the city 25% of what they would pay in taxes if they weren't tax exempt. The major Boston newspaper has endorsed this proposal. I doubt that this will be the last city in the United States that is going to bring forward a proposal like this. We know that public revenues are really hurting. So it seems to me that if we want to preserve foundation tax exemption and other privileges, and I do, we better have a good answer to the question of what exactly it is that foundations exist for, what they're actually doing, what their achievements are in relation to the public good. And again, as I've said, I think this book is an example of helping us with that project. Final point, again on the issue of autonomy, freedom, and independence. The editors of this fine new book say that this may be the great potential of foundations. They recognize that this leaves foundations to, quote, largely do as they please, unquote. They acknowledge that those nonprofits which foundations support often give up their autonomy as a condition of a foundation grant. Many of you are probably familiar with the, I think it's become almost classic piece by John Pratt in a 2004 issue of the Nonprofit Quarterly, which looks at different funding sources in relation to autonomy, meaning the autonomy of the grantee, and reliability. Foundations receive the highest score on limiting grantee autonomy. So while foundations make great efforts, as they should, to guard their own independence, they're fairly loath to grant the same privilege to the group they fund. I thank you for listening, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. And good afternoon. It's always great to be back here at the Hudson Institute. As David Hammack suggested in his remarks, it's roughly a century has elapsed since the first modern foundations were created. Indeed, the magazine Philanthropy, which is coming out, I got the online version yesterday, so it should be available very shortly, devotes most of its issue to observing that anniversary, particularly marked by the centenary of the founding of the Carnegie Corporation in 1911 as a kind of handy marker of when modern foundations were created. A lot of very good discussion in that issue, as in this book, about the question, now that 100 years has gone by, have foundations been a useful invention for the American philanthropic tradition? Or have they been a harmful one? Or perhaps we may conclude they've largely been inconsequential. To think about the question this way reminds me of a perhaps apocryphal story told, this being China Week in Washington, or I guess earlier this week, having to do with the time that President Richard Nixon first visited China. He was briefed in advance by his Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, who told him that one of the principal people he'd be meeting with, then Premier Zhou Enlai, was a great aficionado of French history. So at one of those quiet moments during the proceedings, President Nixon turned to Zhou Enlai and asked him, "What do you think about the impact of the French Revolution?" To which Zhou Enlai responded, "It's too soon to tell." Well, in a way, that's the message of this book. About half as much time has elapsed from the French Revolution, and can't really say very well whether or not the impact has been a salutary one. I was struck by Susan's last comment urging foundations to do a better job explaining what they exist for. Well, after 100 years, if we still need to explain what it is that these organizations exist to do, something hasn't quite clicked. We have a 450-page book here that seeks to explain, in a way, what foundations do. And while there's lots of great information in it, at the end of the day, it's not particularly evident, at least to this reader, that we have a very clear answer. Now, that's not for a lack of trying, as I've mentioned, and as David showed admirably in his PowerPoint. There's a lot of good information in the book. It is organized by fields. That was a choice David and Helmut made, and there are other ways of having done that as well. You could have organized them by size, scope, age, beliefs. One that seems to be missing is the involvement of the donor. But taken as it is, looking at fields, this book provides a great deal of information. But what does one conclude? First of all, I conclude that foundations can claim a variety of useful accomplishments, though few, if any, are world-changing. That's not surprising, since, as we've heard, they account for just a small share of philanthropic resources. A lot of what foundations have done seems a good deal less than the innovative claims their defenders have made for them. Overall, it's kind of hard to accept the argument that the foundation world constitutes, as the Peterson Commission once put it, social venture capital in American society. That increasingly seems like the kind of self-flattery one hears, well, from venture capitalists as well. They did a certain number of things, but whether or not they created those large effects that the foundation world often likes to talk about is very dubious based on the evidence in this book. Much also depends on the field one looks at. Education and healthcare differ from religion and the arts, which in turn differ from social movements or international affairs, principally because of the relative size of foundation resources in relation to other kinds of resources. Sometimes foundations could hardly do more than complement, or to use a currently fashionable word, nudge, activities that were much better funded by other donors, government, or those who use them. When you think about it, though, that's not a particularly bad thing if one sees pluralism as one of the essential virtues of our philanthropic tradition. Having too much influence could be worse than having too little. It's worth reminding that in Democracy in America, Alexis de Tocqueville saw the development of an aristocracy of commercial wealth as perhaps presenting the kinds of challenges that he worried about from an aristocracy of genes, at least to civic engagement. A third point in this book is that a key variable in the impact of foundations is the role of government vis-a-vis philanthropy. Foundations had more scope to operate when government was less prominent than when it was more active. Changes over time, the nation's political philosophy, and of course this changed over time with the nation's political philosophy, and of course by field. The authors talk a lot about how foundations have complemented or substituted for publicly funded initiatives and occasionally challenged them. What they haven't said much about, however, is the degree to which they have been co-opted by them, put their resources to use in ways that reflected political fashions or even at the service of political fashions, rather than operated with the independence their assets and other attributes presumably give them. According to this book, foundations don't seem to have been responsible for any disasters, unless one considers the accomplishments of conservative foundations as retrograde, as one contributor seems to do, while grudgingly admitting their successful tactics. A chapter or two on great philanthropic mistakes, as Martin Morse Worcester has called them, would have been refreshing and instructive. Ocean Hill-Brownsville, anyone? The New Math, the Gray Areas program, public television, pick your poison. And not only specific grants, but whole fields. What have been the consequences of foundation support for some of the fashions in education, or helping the poor, for example? I was glad to hear that you're going to have a panel here. Annie Casey Foundation has been one of the exceptions in its willingness to address this set of questions, and it'd be interesting how they reflect upon them. And David, actually, in his PowerPoint, if I'm not mistaken, that PowerPoint is not to be found in this book.
Actually, mostly pulled from the book.
It's pulled from the book, but it takes some digging. Did refer to those, and some of them are more in the nature of failures of aspiration rather than failures of commission. But if foundations are especially suited to taking risks, shouldn't we have expected at least a few to have fallen on their faces? And most importantly, what did they and we learn when they did? Finally, judging from this book, A relatively small number of foundations, notably Ford, Carnegie, Rockefeller, and some others, not yet including Gates, which gets relatively short shrift in this book, undoubtedly because of the time it was written, seem to be where a lot of the action has been. This is partly an artifact, I think, of the data available, which relies heavily, as David indicated, on the Foundation Center, on archival research, some independent surveys. And for reasons I don't have time to go into now, all that leaves much to be desired, and it would be great to have other sources of information about the work of Foundation. But it also reflects the difficulties sometimes of tracing Foundation impacts. Most foundations are local, as David's PowerPoint on Cleveland showed so vividly, where they can have a sizable effect, even with a relatively small amount of money. They are often rooted in the issues and personalities of particular communities, more than grand national dramas called the Great Society or the Reagan Revolution. Yet this book, like most others dealing with American foundations, tells us next to nothing about what might call the fortune, when we might call in this context, and with apologies, the fortune at the bottom of the pyramid. Although some authors, I do want to note in fairness, have tried to carry out such studies. Tocqueville probably would have been appalled, perhaps seeing work such as this as a form of aristocratic portraiture, rather than an account of the uses to which Americans put Foundation philanthropy. I don't think this omission is only the result of data insufficiency or the difficulty and cost of collecting it. I think it also reflects what I would call a kind of scholarly particularism, a tendency to focus on a particular kind of foundation, one whose hallmark is an effort to professionalize and secularize grant-making, a project congenial to many, if not most, of the people who do research on foundations. I would be interested when we get to discussion. David mentioned that the number of the authors celebrate the amateurism of foundations. I didn't see too much of that here.
I meant to say foundations, though.
Oh, foundations celebrate.
Evidence that it is celebrated.
Okay. Well, starting with the establishment of the Russell Sage Foundation in 1906 and the Rockefeller Foundation 4 years later, a number of wealthy donors embraced the idea that research and analysis could be useful in guiding decisions about what to support. The establishment of the Cleveland Foundation, which David noted in 1914, brought community foundations into existence, and their leaders also believed in the value of social surveys and other methods of investigation for informing their grant-making. Influenced by early 20th century principles of scientific management, major industrial corporations such as the American Telephone and Telegraph Company and the Ford Motor Company began to provide a variety of health, social, and educational services for their employees in the communities in which they operated. The result was that the advent of the modern foundation marked not just a new institutional form, but a new approach to giving. Previously, giving was often a matter of a person's deciding voluntarily to contribute time or money. These gifts could be far-sighted and far-reaching, but for better or worse, they reflected the often particular and, as David noted, sometimes paternalistic interests and intentions of their donors. With notable exceptions, most were focused on the communities where their givers lived or worked, partly because they comprise such a substantial portion of the nonprofit sector. A large share of donations was also directed toward religious organizations rather than toward non-sectarian social purposes. The new grant-making organizations changed that. Drawing on their own business experience, donors hired growing numbers of trained experts or practitioners to assist them in making grants. Rather than giving money, mostly for immediate local needs, they transferred their funds to organizations which built up endowments that could continue to operate beyond their donors' lifetimes and address long-term problems. Support for religious charities became a diminished priority, radically diminished for these foundations. By the 1960s, the largest and most influential grant makers had embraced this model of giving. They were, James Douglas and Aaron Wildofsky would later write, the knowledgeable foundations, because they understood their missions to be supporting the development and application of expertise to problems of broad public concern. Moreover, at least to institutional philanthropy's champions, the professionalization of grant-making, while not without its problems, seemed to have compiled an admirable record of achievement. But from the beginning, it was also subject to criticism. Often the attacks came from populists on the political left and right, who claimed that foundations were actually a means of advancing the interests of their wealthy patrons who provided the funding and typically approved donations, rather than for serving the public's interests. These critics achieved their greatest success with the Tax Reform Act of 1969. During nearly a decade of investigations and hearings, proposals that threatened to require foundations to spend all their money and cease operating after they had existed for a number of years received serious consideration. Congress ultimately rejected them, but enacted a series of rules designed to regulate grant-making by foundations, including a requirement that they spend or pay out at least a certain amount of their money each year. In addition, the assumption behind foundation philanthropy that professionalization could improve grant-making has faced several different kinds of criticisms. From the left, it has been charged that the experts who work for or advise grant-making organizations are really philanthropic mandarins, out of touch with the people they should be trying to help and more adept at creating bureaucratic hurdles than achieving social change. From the right has come the complaint that the staffs of institutional grant makers do not actually know as much as they claim, cling to outmoded, often technocratic ideas, or pursue agendas that fail to address social problems effectively and may be at odds with what the donors who underwrite their organizations would have wanted them to do. Wildofsky and Douglas were skeptical that foundations could promote social change. Instead, they insisted on the value of their role as monitors and evaluators. Legislators and regulators have looked suspiciously at the amount of money spent on professional grant-making staff and consultants or placed into the large endowments that sustain them beyond their donors' lifetimes, and asked whether or not more money should be going directly and sooner to grantees. Underlying these criticisms is the arguably less than impressive record of accomplishment portrayed in American foundations. While determining success in philanthropy is never a simple task, a number of recent high-profile foundation efforts in a variety of fields have generally been judged disappointing. Perhaps the most notable was a $500 million challenge by the Annenberg Foundation aimed at improving urban school systems. The results were widely acknowledged to have been slim. After investing nearly $90 million over a 15-year period in his Fighting Back program, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation conceded that its efforts to deal with community drug and alcohol abuse problems had been unsuccessful. As I mentioned earlier, I think a weakness of American foundations is that it doesn't treat this part of the record very much, although some authors do note, as I said, some aspirational failures, such as not winning public support for the League of Nations or doing enough to enact health care reform sooner. To be sure, foundations continue to undertake ambitious initiatives, such as the Gates Foundation's effort to eradicate malaria and other deadly diseases, and these look much like those undertaken by institutional philanthropy in its halcyon years. Moreover, to a number of foundation leaders and observers, including one of this volume's co-editors, the one who is not here, I should add, the cure for what ails institutional philanthropy requires that it become more strategic, which usually means more professional and businesslike in its efforts. But to others, the problems foundations face may be seen as more fundamental and require changing the model on which it has been built. Instead of relying on applying scientific or professional expertise, they argue grant makers should enlist more involvement from those they were seeking to help, play a more activist role than making grants to address the problems that concern them, and become more entrepreneurial in their efforts. In other words, foundations need to do more to incorporate the kinds of impulses that have long characterized other parts of the American nonprofit sector, but have not been a particularly distinctive feature of modern grant-making organizations. In short, following a period of unprecedented growth, key elements of the rationale on which institutional philanthropy has been based are now being challenged. The resources of grant-making organizations may be more plentiful than ever, but how they ought to be used is increasingly in dispute. For over a century, as this book shows, foundations and other forms of institutional philanthropy have been prominent parts of the American nonprofit sector and serving not only as financial intermediaries, but also in theory and often in practice, adding expertise, perspective, continuity, and the ability to take risks. However, to critics from outside and inside, not only are foundations failing to deliver on their promise, the value of the approach to grant-making foundations have historically embodied no longer seems as clear-cut, as progressive as it once did. Foundations are, in a way, facing not, I would think, a crisis of purpose, but an identity crisis, whose outcome could lead them toward greater professionalization on the one hand, or toward altogether radically different approaches to grant-making on the other. The current resurgence of populism in the United States, witnessed not only the conservative populism of the Tea Party movement, but the left-wing populism that helped put President Obama in the White House, increases the likelihood that foundations, like all elite institutions, are in for a period of closer scrutiny as well. There are echoes of these challenges in American foundations, but the largely unquestioned assumption that professionalization in grant-making is desirable or should be more fully realized has produced a volume that tells us a great many things about foundations, except whether or not the approach to grant-making, the most influential of them embody, has been a fruitful one. Perhaps David and Helmut will address that in their next book.
Hi. Thanks for the opportunity to be here today. And I, as the fourth panelist here, I thought what I would do is talk about where we go from here. I can kind of pick up on what both Les said as well as Susan and David said. And I want to make a few key points. I want to argue, building upon what David said, that the changing role of foundations and the identity crisis, as Les put it, is related in part to the growth of government, but also to the way that government has grown. And that includes the diversification in terms of the way that government addresses public and social problems. And also the growth of nonprofits themselves and the diversification of the sector itself, which I'll talk about in a minute. And also more competition at the local level, in particular, for the roles that many foundations have historically played. And so So first of all, in terms of the growth of the sector, David had that nice slide that talked about the growth of government spending, particularly starting in the 1960s. The nonprofit sector, in terms of number of 501c3s, has grown to from approximately 150,000 in 1965 to over 1 million today. So you've had tremendous growth in the number of nonprofit organizations during that period of time. You've also, in terms of that slide that David put up, the way that government spent its money changed rather dramatically. Many of particularly in the health and social services area, a lot of money was spent through contracting. Government was funding nonprofit organizations, or they funded state and local government, which then funded nonprofit organizations. There's been an increase in various kinds of voucher payments, which has boosted the demand for nonprofit services, such as in childcare, housing vouchers, education vouchers continue to be quite limited, but remarkably controversial. I noticed today that Speaker Boehner has reintroduced the vouchers for the District of Columbia, which would boost the demand for particularly many of the nonprofit charter schools that are here in D.C. We've also had an increase in tax credits, which we have, in the last 25 years, invented a low-income, primarily nonprofit housing industry that relies heavily on tax credits, but also other kinds of funding, including tax-exempt bonds. It occasionally gets foundation grants, many of these organizations. But we've essentially, through tax credits and the innovative use of different kinds of policy tools, created and stimulated the demand for more nonprofit organizations at the local level, which I would argue has also changed the role for foundations. The diversification of policy tools has also drawn foundations into increasingly complex public-private partnerships at the local level. Housing organizations are a good example, but many other kinds of services where foundations are part of many funders that are contributing to the support of a particular organization. I think that the growth in number of nonprofits has obviously put pressure on nonprofits to look for various new sources of revenue, a lot of pressure on raising money from individual donors, generating earned income. We've heard a lot in the last 20 years or so about social enterprises and trying to be entrepreneurial in how you raise your money. And so that has forced nonprofits to think about diversifying their revenue and thinking about different sources of revenue that, again, has made foundation grants less relevant in the larger scheme of things. So I would argue that it's not only the growth of government, but it's also the increase in the number of nonprofit organizations and the diversification, the way we address social problems in terms of funding, that has then forced an identity crisis for foundations. And I think that you see this playing out in several different ways today in the policy arena as well as at the local level. First, there's tremendous interest in outcome evaluation and performance assessment. The archetypal nonprofit example of this, I think, has been the Harlem Children's Zone. Several, books and cases and articles have been written about the Harlem Children's Zone, but it's noteworthy in the context of this discussion because it certainly, the Harlem Children's Zone was transformed by a grant from the Edna McConnell Clark Foundation that tried to focus on outcomes and essentially dramatically changing the way it gave grants, focusing on outcome. And essentially, if these organizations didn't meet the outcomes, they got defunded. And so that the emphasis on outcome evaluation, logic models, performance assessment has certainly spread throughout the foundation world, particularly the national foundations, but certainly also at the local level. Now, many of the non-staff foundations are not in a position to track outcomes in the same way, but the idea that foundations should be assessing their impact, I think, has proved very powerful, and certainly the kinds of organizations that are currently being profiled as model nonprofits are those nonprofits that are tracking outcomes, and they have a very tight logic model, and And I think, and this is also being, this kind of thinking is also being disseminated through various books that have become bestsellers in the nonprofit management literature. Forces for Good. Many other books have also focused on this role of foundations and tracking outcomes and focusing on performance assessment. I think that this, the other way you see the kind of search for relevance and impact is through partnerships with the public sector. Now, certainly foundations have partnered with the public sector for a long time, as chronicled in the book, but I think that there's a lot of interesting developments that are going on, particularly at the local level, that where you have these kind of hybrid organizations. Many of them are nonprofit C3 organizations, but many of them are intermediary organizations which then subcontract with local nonprofits. In just a couple examples, in Washington State, there's an organization called Thrive by Five. It's an early education program. Gates was instrumental in setting it up, but it got, several foundations from Washington State also funded it, but it's also got a lot of money from the public sector. East Baltimore Community Development Corporation here closer to home, has money from Casey. It's got money from local foundations in Baltimore. It's got Hopkins is giving money to it. It's got money from the city of Baltimore. It's got money from the city of Maryland. I mean, these hybrid organizations, I think, represent many. I mean, it also represents the way we've been rethinking our approach to social problems. But I think that it's another way for foundations to think differently about what their impact is. It also raises questions about autonomy, because certainly many of these kind of hybrid organizations and initiatives, foundations, any given one foundation is one player among many, and so the idea of the kind of autonomous foundation that's funding a particular initiative that they have a lot of control over is not really the case in many of these initiatives, where foundations are just contributing money and to have a broader impact. I mean, that's the idea, is that you pool this money and then you have a broader impact than if you just had a grant from one particular foundation. Certainly, it seems to me that this search for relevance and impact is exemplified in the Social Innovations Fund. For those, I'm sure many in this crowd know about the Social Innovation Fund, but it's an Obama administration initiative with federal dollars, but that federal money has then been matched by several large foundations, particularly those that have come out of the high-tech world. Skoll Foundation has contributed $10 million. Amidar has contributed several $1 million. And the emphasis then is trying to find programs that you can take to scale, so that the phrase "going to scale," that foundations should be funding initiatives that go to scale. So that the idea here is that historically foundations focused on funding a particular organization, and hopefully it was effective. And if it's effective, then it wasn't necessarily benefiting somebody in a different city or a different community. So the term "going to scale" is that foundations should be trying to fund initiatives that they can take to scale. And so the idea of the Social Innovations Fund and the idea of this foundation matching some of the money from the Social Innovations Fund is that promising initiatives can be identified and then taken to scale. Again, the Harlem Children's Zone is a good example. The Obama administration picked up on this idea, and at least initially it proposed that this would again get replicated in 20 cities around the country. I think that for budgetary reasons that may not be happening, but nonetheless the idea was that we shouldn't just have one successful program in New York City, we should have it replicated around the country. And so in my view, the whole idea about going to scale and the role of foundations in that is another way that foundations are kind of searching for impact and identity, and a new identity in this new environment where they're facing a lot of competition for influence and impact. The other point I would make is that in this going to scale, many of these initiatives are being funded through these kind of hybrid collaborative organizations at the local level. For example, the Social Innovations Fund has funded Jobs for the Future, Boston-based organization, which is then funding 20 organizations around the country. But if you look at what these are doing, they're, again, complicated public-private initiatives that are collaborations among various kinds of nonprofit, private foundations at the local level and local government. And again, I think it's another way, to the extent that foundations join in these initiatives, it's a way for them to have a broader impact than they would otherwise have with focusing on one small particular program. I think that at least the increased discussion among the foundation world of program-related investments, which for those of you who don't know what program-related investments is, that the tax code allows foundations to invest in socially worthy investments if they meet certain criteria, and it can be in a nonprofit or a for-profit organization. Typically, nonprofit, a good example might be that the Annie Casey Foundation sets up a revolving loan fund for some of their grantees that they can take advantage of, and the Annie Casey gets some kind of return on their investment, and because the loans are then paid back to Annie Casey. I think that there's certainly been more discussion of using PRI investments as a way of increasing the leverage and impact of foundations. It remains to be seen how widespread this becomes. But it certainly is part of this broader discussion within the foundational world of mission-based investing and using your assets to try to leverage what you're doing and have more impact. Again, I think it remains to be seen, and I'd be interested in what other people on the panel and the audience think about to what extent will mission-based investing become much more common among foundations. I think that the other issue that, again, it remains to be seen how it plays out is certainly there's more interest, at least in some foundations, in funding advocacy and public education as another way of gaining more leverage, right? If you have a relatively modest amounts of money, if you fund an advocacy organization that influences public policy, potentially you can have a lot more impact than if you just funded an individual organization. Certainly there are a lot of examples around the country of this. But many foundations remain very cautious about funding advocacy, public education, even if they're doing it through third parties. So I think the jury is obviously still out on that. I think that one other area where I see some evidence of the new search for identity among foundations is concentrating grants, so that particularly at the local level, you see some foundations saying, well, instead of giving out a lot of small grants where we're not having much impact, we're going to pool all our money and have a big impact in one area. Two examples, in Seattle, the Medina Foundation took all of its grant money and invested in creating a new low-income payday loan organization as a way of helping low-income individuals who didn't have to go to high-priced payday loan places. Northwest Areas Foundation is kind of going through another reevaluation, but some of you may know that for over a period of 15 years or so, they took a lot of their grants and then concentrated them in trying to help disadvantaged communities as a way of gaining greater impact and relevance. And the United Way has certainly done that. United Way is not a foundation; it's a C3. But if you look across the country, the United Way is many of the United Ways are trying to take a lot of what were used to be small grants and then identifying high priority areas such as ending homelessness and pooling their resources and trying to have an impact in that way. I think the United Ways have been subject to many of the same pressures that you see among local foundations. And indeed, local foundation, I would argue the United Way, which in many communities is behaving like a community foundation by raising endowment money, they have restricted grants now as opposed to unrestricted grants, is now become a competitor to community foundations in terms of trying to set the agenda for local communities. And another reason why many local foundations are feeling like they need to figure out another way of having greater impact is because the United Ways are now kind of encroaching on what used to be their turf at the local level. In conclusion, I would just say that I think that I worry that this enthusiasm for impact and performance assessment has gone too far, that it tends to crowd out various kinds of programs that are difficult to evaluate that may be very valuable to do. Advocacy is a good example, difficult to evaluate whether you're having much of an impact. But certainly more generally, things that things that we value as a society, such as civic engagement, promoting democracy at the local level, various kinds of community service activities. It seems to me that foundations play an important role in supporting many of those at the local level, and they're not easy to evaluate. And this current enthusiasm for evaluation, I worry that those kinds of activities get crowded out. And then finally, I think that the kind of changes that are rippling through the foundation world at the local level, I think will push greater scrutiny of foundations, but I think particularly greater scrutiny of community foundations, which have a lot of restricted dollars that make it difficult to be quickly responsive to local needs, and with the cutbacks at state and local funding, and I think will accelerate a greater scrutiny of how community foundations operate and what they're doing and how they're spending their money, and which is part of, I think, a more general push for more accountability and transparency. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Well, thank you all. I'd like to put one question to the panel, and in particular to David, although, David, you should feel free to respond as you wish to the comments from the panelists. But I'm struck by this notion that both Les and Steve raised, the notion of an identity crisis or a crisis of purpose in the foundation field. And I wonder if to some extent some of the problems that, especially that Professor Ostrander mentioned in philanthropic behavior, some of those problems don't result from a continuation of the identity of foundations as they were in the days of Carnegie, Rockefeller, and Russell Sage, i.e., giants, giants in the field, able to influence vast segments of American life. Foundations, to some extent, seem to continue to think of themselves in that way, in spite of the fact that they are now, as your book points out, severely diminished. And as all the panelists have noted, the resources of foundations relative to the areas they're trying to influence quite reduced, and yet they continue to think, as Professor Ostrander says, they continue to be one of the most controlling of sources of funds, as if they were in fact still the big players on the field, or as Professor Linkowski pointed out, they continue to operate as if professionalism and scientific philanthropy, appropriately applied, will make big changes. And as Stephen pointed out, of course, that means something of a narrowing of the focus of foundations, and yet it is, in another sense, a continuation of this sense that by measurement and by scientific philanthropy we can control the outcomes in a way that really isn't possible anymore. Are foundations identifying themselves as Carnegie and Rockefeller, and is some of their bad behavior or inadequate behavior following from that, and in an era when in fact they're much diminished? They just don't understand that they're smaller players in a much bigger field.
It's a big question, and there's a lot of things tied together to it. I don't know quite what's meant when we say foundations take a certain view. There are over 100,000 foundations. There are 100 foundations with $500 million of resources. And they're very different from each other, even those 100 big ones. One of the things I hope we made some contribution to in this book is to call attention to the variety of foundations and the diversity, and therefore the difficulty of generalizing. And I think that's true now. I think it's been true over time. It was even true in the heyday of Carnegie and Rockefeller, and a number with them, some of which nobody's ever heard of today. The Chemical Foundation was critical in building the American building chemistry as a field in the United States, and nobody knows about it now, but it was very important. There were Guggenheim foundations that were critical to aeronautics. There are a number of there are many examples of that. But that cluster of foundations pursuing the knowledgeable foundations that Wildavsky and Douglas talked about were never the only kind of foundation, even in their heyday. It seems to me that if you're criticizing if you have an agenda you'd like to see pushed more, whether it's from the left or the right, or whether you have an evangelical religious purpose or some other kind of purpose, then it's rhetorically useful to characterize foundations with a very broad brush and then say foundations aren't doing what they ought to be doing. And by the same token, if you are the Council on Foundations, you have to speak not only to foundations, but to Congress and to the regulators, and you need one voice. So there are pressures that lead people to make broad generalizations. And getting into detail means it's no longer a soundbite. Nobody would ever put what I just said on the evening news, and I've tried to be brief. One other thing I wanted to say about this, and I really appreciated everybody's comments, very thoughtful, so I welcome all of them. Susan ended by asking what members of a democratic society want from foundations, and it seems to me there's two ways to answer that, and on one of them I think we won't ever have agreement, and that is substantively what should the agenda of all foundations be. I don't think we're not going to get an agenda.
Right.
We're not getting. There was a lot of consensus about reforming healthcare in this country. But then trying to say exactly what that means ain't easy. And you could say that about every other major field that foundations engage. Now, I think what Ken Pruitt has in mind is that foundations reflect something else, which is a consensus that there ought to be freedom of speech and freedom of advocacy. And you add to that, and I think it goes with the emphasis on private property. If there is private property and people should be free to dispose of it as they wish, then they can put it behind whatever they want to accomplish with it. Then, of course, if they want the rest of us to defer to them or praise them for it, they're going to have to ask us what we think, and we may say what we think.
Gotcha. Yeah. Les, did you?
Yeah, I certainly take David's point about the variety of foundations. But that also suggests, with regard specifically to this book, that maybe a different type of organization would have been useful. If you start out by saying, so what have foundations accomplished in, name your field, you're inevitably drawn toward those larger foundations that are spending lots of money, that have a long history of activity, that have very broad goals in these fields, and so on. If instead you cut up the foundation world somewhat different by size, by involvement of donor, by age of formation, by any number of ways, you get a different picture of foundations. This is, of course, our famous story about the elephant and all the people trying to describe it. There are lots of different ways to describe foundations. I think by choosing to raise the questions of what difference have they made in particular fields, one is inevitably implying a particular model of foundations.
Please.
Just very briefly, and I'm eager to hear from
Yeah.
some of you, but I completely agree with David about substance, that I don't think foundations should agree about that. And I do understand Professor Pruitt's larger point. It does seem to me, though, that there is some possibly emerging, not at all new historical roots. You could tell me more about the role of not only foundations but nonprofits in general in building a democratic society, in supporting, and this may be the importance of the convening and the broker role. And so that would be some thought of a common purpose, at least. And I do think identity and purpose are not quite the same thing. Secondly, very quickly, I am equally puzzled by the issue of not so much why don't foundations maybe get it that they're not the major players that history tells us they were once, but why particularly the really big, rich, powerful ones, or formerly powerful ones, sort of feel so defensive. And the issue of legitimacy, which other volumes raise a little bit more than this one does, I really admire the foundations, and again, they're usually the small ones on the left and on the right who say, this is who we are, this is what we do, this is why we think it's important. Maybe you don't agree with us, but that it's partly about transparency. I mean, part of why there's not more good research on foundations, and all researchers have said this, is because we can't get in. Part of why I study the small little public ones is they let me in. I go to board meetings, I go to grant meetings, I go to whatever they're doing, I'm there, and I can write about it. I can't get that kind of access, and nobody can, to the big private foundation. Why? Why so concerned about the legitimacy? And I think that's part of the defensiveness about having to keep saying we're major players, we're changing the world, or we ought to be, rather than sort of saying, well, we're doing this and we think it's good and we hope you like it. Look it up on our website. Come to our meeting.
We do have a terrific audience here, so questions, please, from the audience. Bob Woodson. And please identify yourself and your institutional affiliation. And wait for the microphone. Yes, you did. Yes, good. And now you may speak.
Bob Woodson, founder, Center for Neighborhood Enterprise in Washington, D.C. My question goes to the area of identity, innovation. In our market economy, 70% of all the jobs are created by small entrepreneurs that are supported by venture capital. Why do we not see that same level of appreciation for the social entrepreneur in the social economy? Most of the foundations fund activities that they design and then parachute into the communities with the expectation. That's why you talk about Annie, Casey, and all these others that have failed, and there's no penalty for those foundations to fail. But the communities that suffer as a consequence, there's a cost there. Would you address that?
I was once talking to a group of foundations that were interested in education, and I suggested before they make grants to particular school systems, the program officers should commit to sending their children to those schools. I've made lots of unpopular suggestions in my life, and this was one of them.
Yeah.
It's a great question. I think it's a great rhetorical question, and I think there's a terrific purpose for doing that. I don't have the expertise to address it exactly in a substantive way. I guess one thing I would say that relates to that is there is a penalty. If a foundation's programs aren't effective and aren't successful, it doesn't help the reputation of the foundation. So in that sense, if they're failing to find really capable partners, then they're losing an opportunity. And the fact that Les, I think we could debate about Annenberg, but Les is not the only one who just pulls that out as a failure. That's a problem for the Annenberg Foundation. Now they tried to part of what they tried to do was to find community partners. And it was so many community partners in so many different areas that at least having a general agreement as to what was the consequence was the only thing you could say was it's hard to see that it made a difference. But I think those are some of the issues.
Yes, please, Perla.
I know it's hard to generalize about best practices amongst foundations, but many of the foundations who I know they have very, very happy grantees are the foundations who actually go out into the neighborhoods and try to understand the community issues and talk to the people who live there and try to really walk a mile in their shoes. Your point about sending program officers to the schools, right? Very similar. And I'm just wondering, it seems to me that seems to be like a best practice that could be generalized. Just, go into the community, listen to the constituents, listen to the constituent voices, listen to the nonprofits as well as the volunteers, as well as the people who are on the streets. If you guys have any comments on that as a potential best practice?
I have one quick comment. If you look at what foundations say their purposes are, some very large fraction, like a third or more, say their purpose is to advance a particular religious perspective. And that kind of practice is central to some religious communities and not to others. A lot of other foundations are very much engaged in the arts. They exist in order to support the Metropolitan Opera. So there's different people that they're going to talk to depending what the purpose is of the foundation. So that's the difficulty of generalizing, is the diversity of foundation purposes.
And yet the practices, Steve, that you were pointing to suggests, and going again to Les's point, it suggests that many contemporary practices on the part of foundations, i.e. Theories, logic models, theories of change, deliverable outcomes. Many of these techniques are formulated almost without regard, right, to what grantees themselves have in mind. The assumption is that the foundations, just as if you read Raymond Fosdick's history of the Rockefeller Foundation, there's no question in Raymond Fosdick's mind that the Rockefeller Foundation damn well knew what it wanted, and it was in a better position to understand that than any of these particular local groups that it was troubled by, with grant requests. Isn't it true in some measure that foundations still reflect that kind of arrogance in these practices, which are quite different from the practices that Perla suggests? And incidentally, go to your website, go to Perla and I's website, which is terrific, her project, greatnonprofits.com, is that correct? Network, yes.
I think you raise a good point, and I think that I also would point out that many of these foundations try to shift the cost of evaluation and assessment to the nonprofit themselves, so that you're not only you're expecting the nonprofit to kind of fit into what you think is important policy priorities, but the evaluation part of it and the preparation of the logic model and tracking outcomes is then shifted to the nonprofit. And government does that as well for many nonprofits, so it's not unique to foundations. But I think that so that's one thing I would say. I think that the other thing that I think is going on is that, particularly given the decline in assets of many foundations are facing a dilemma in the kinds of best practices that you identified require additional staff on the part of foundations, and adding to the administrative staff of foundations is difficult, which is another reason why you've seen this kind of pressure to shift some of the cost to your grantees in terms of tracking outcomes and evaluating your program.
Yes, please.
My name is Valerie Lassiter, and first let me, since this is a question and answer, it's really not a question, may I have permission to make a statement?
As long as it's very brief.
It's very brief. As I was sitting back here thinking, and running a small business that works a lot with nonprofit organizations, and also at Town University teaching the resource development policy program. What I hear, and this may be just from my business mind, is I hear assumptions and misfits. In that, yes, I do think that as a foundation you have to try to fit into what the needs of the community are. But I also think that there's a happy medium that has to be found, and often what I find is that not much time is put into what I call the dating and courting of the relationship between the foundation and the nonprofit to make sure that there is a good fit in terms of what needs and desires are on both ends. And so we rush to grant make, I think, and we do it in a 6-month period or a 3-month period, when really it was not enough courting stage to really see what the outputs could be from the foundation side and what the outputs could be from the nonprofit side. I don't know if that's helpful.
Let me grab yeah. Oh, terrific. Yes. Let me get Aaron and Professor O'Connor. Yeah. Let me get to. And incidentally, with Aaron's question, I should acknowledge his terrific help in setting these panels up. I regularly turn to Aaron Dorfman at the National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy for advice and counsel, and I'm deeply appreciative of your willingness to take the time to give me that advice. So,
happy to help with those. And can we really call it arrogance on the part of foundations, Bill, if they actually are smarter than all the rest of us?
That's a good point. I had overlooked that possibility.
Yes. We've learned in recent days that the Margaret Cargill Foundation in Minnesota is suddenly going to be much larger than many of us had thought. We thought it might be a $2 billion foundation or thereabouts, and we've now learned that it's going to be a $9 billion foundation. Just wondering, there's such immense experience on this panel, wondering if you had the ear of the 2 trustees of this foundation, 1 or 2 pieces of advice you would give the leaders of a new $9 billion foundation.
2 trustees. Why don't we get Professor O'Connor's question as well, if we could get the microphone back. Sorry. Yeah. Professor O'Connor has also been on a panel a couple of years ago. Yes, right.
I'm Alice O'Connor. I contributed to the volume. I teach at UC Santa Barbara. In thinking about this question of the identity crisis, and also the way foundations have historically justified themselves. One of the historic, especially in the post-war period, justifications was that they needed to exist as institutions outside the market, but also outside of government, right? So that they needed to be part of this third way idea. And I'm wondering the degree to which you would argue, and perhaps some of the changes Steve was talking about, for example, but also what Susan Ostrander was talking about in terms of the justification for tax exemption. Can you fold that into a larger crisis of identity in terms of how foundations think about their relationship to the market? We've been in a transformative period, certainly in the past 3 or 4 decades, in terms of the way we as a society think about government and think about the market and their respective roles. And it's hard to imagine that foundations, whether they acknowledge it or not, have not been affected by it. So I wonder if, in the few minutes we have, if you would care to comment on that idea.
And why don't we make this the last set of answers from the panel, so we have both the advice to the 2 trustees of the $9 billion Cargill Foundation and this question of the relationship of foundations to the market. And Professor O'Connor, if I don't mean to mischaracterize your position, but you've eloquently argued in publications that, of course, we have seen in recent years a resurgence of the market and its effect on philanthropy, in part through foundations that are conservative foundations, if you will. I'm sorry. Go ahead, panelists, or anything else you would like to say as the last.
I'd be glad to, and give another shameless plug to Philanthropy Magazine. I did write the cover story on Carnegie for this issue, and which was really a lot of fun, whereas most sensible people during winter break go skiing or something. Academics, of course, spend their time in libraries reading books. So I wound up spending a lot of time with good old Andra, and in a sense, both of these questions are addressed if you look at his life and what he stood for. You could read the article to see whether I think the Carnegie Corporation follows through on that. But one of the things in the Gospel of Wealth he talks about is indiscriminate charity. And by that, of course, he means providing funds willy-nilly. Instead, he says you should provide your funds to those who are trying to help themselves, and to those institutions that in turn will help those help themselves. And I think in terms of the advice to the Cargill people, Aaron is one of my former students as well, I'm proud to say, and another of your classmate, well, wasn't your classmate, but another alum, I think is going to have a big role in that foundation, is really philanthropy, advice to the trustees would be to look for people or people and the institutions that help such people who are trying to help themselves and underwrite those. Too often, I think, and again, with a caveat of the detail here, I think foundations see their role as operating the other way, supporting those who may not, in fact, be helping themselves, but just the opposite, may be seen as victims in some sense or another. With regard to Alice's question, the other part of Carnegie's life that's very misunderstood is that he saw the purpose of philanthropy to support the capitalist system, to support the market. That's what it's all about. In a way, the Carnegie Corporation is a monument to failure, in the sense that Carnegie did not give away all his wealth during his life, and instead, despite his own concerns to the contrary, gives it to the Carnegie Foundation. But there's no doubt at all in his mind that the purpose of philanthropy ought to increase opportunities that would enable others to enjoy the same set of good fortune that he'd enjoyed himself. And yet, again, respecting the differences, it seems to me that a lot of philanthropy, including in foundation philanthropy in the Second World War, has operated on the premise not that their job is to make it possible for others to enjoy the benefits of the market, but rather that the market is the obstacle to the enjoyment of those benefits and must itself be changed. And I think that's a wrong-headed way to go.
Yeah, anyone else, please? Final comments, final thoughts.
Those of you who know my work, it would not surprise you to suggest that my response to Aaron's question would be first steps in terms of how the Cargill Foundation goes about making that decision, rather than what decision they would make. There are many existing structured democratic processes that communities and nonprofits and local governments use to make decisions about priorities. And so convening a community forum and using some of those structured processes and having that body come up with what are the most pressing issues and problems in our community, and then putting some representatives from that community on the decision-making boards to make sure that those are the priorities that get funded.
I would endorse what Susan just said. I think my only caveat, I guess, would be that I think that from what I've seen, I think sometimes during this priority setting process that happens at the community level, the priorities that are identified are our government's priorities, such as improved public education or ending homelessness, where government already has a very, very substantial role. And I think that the caution would be that foundations need to think about, one, what niche are they going to contribute here if there's a lot of money flowing into these urgent public priorities already. And I mean, I think a good example of this is public education, actually. If you think about it around the country, a lot of foundations are putting so much money into public education that, and a lot of this is actually after a community agenda setting process. But I think foundations need to think about what they can contribute here, and also think about some of the other priorities in the community that may be left not addressed, that foundations could usefully make a contribution and have a big impact. I think that the issue about the market, I think that quickly I'll just mention that I think that the whole social enterprise movement that has emerged in the last 10 or 15 years, which focuses nonprofits more on thinking about their relationship to the market, certainly has gotten some support from foundations. I do think that what we've seen in recent years is the limitations of social enterprise strategy, and that a lot of nonprofits are not actually well positioned to take advantage of a lot of market strategies because they're dependent upon government or philanthropy or individual donors. And so I think that that's another, if I was going to say going forward, I think that social enterprises is a great strategy in some areas, but also it's a limited strategy for many types of nonprofits. So, and then one final point.
Sure.
The address to the statement that the woman made in the back about donor engagement and working with donors, I think it's an interesting, there's been a lot of attention through the venture philanthropy literature about working closely with donors. And certainly there are a lot of great examples around the country, social venture partners, venture philanthropy here in town, where they have worked closely with donors. But it's interesting, one of the interesting I think things for discussion is why hasn't that had such a big impact on many foundations? A lot of great work is going on with giving circles and other kinds of initiatives, such as through social venture partners, where you're getting that kind of donor engagement, but not so much in many foundations. And so that's another kind of area for the future where hopefully that would have more of an impact.
David, last word.
Maybe this is relevant to both questions. While there's been a lot of there are many who would like to see the government role in American health, education, and welfare grow still further. There's also resistance to that. And it has seemed to me that it has stayed as large as it is because we've found some ways, and they're awkward and they're not as effective as they might be, and they have all kinds of unfortunate side effects. But we found some ways to accommodate difference and still have government funding of things like healthcare and higher education. Much of the movement for vouchers in elementary and secondary education is an effort to get government funding for religious schools. And if that moves further in that direction, that barrier will be further broken, I think. So then you have questions of how do we do that and still retain opportunity for the disadvantaged? How do you retain some attention to equity? How, on the other hand, do you set up rules that allow legitimate difference, and what is a legitimate difference, but how do you determine what that is, and how do you let legitimate difference still gain support without having a system that's incredibly complicated and that we spend, 5 or 6% of GDP simply managing our healthcare system, so that we don't have to have fights about which care is legitimate under a particular religious perspective or another. But then you also have people trying to pursue professional advantage under the color of the First Amendment. So there are both questions, I think, about the market versus the role of government, but also questions about where can a foundation put its oar in, and maybe in some of that business of trying to figure out those complicated details about how do you reconcile accommodation of difference and, in a sense, liberty with the aspiration for equality. Maybe that's a place where Cargill could look.
There we are. Very good. Okay, let's thank our panel for a terrific conversation.
Great to see you.
Thank you.
Thank you.